Let me hand it over to Michael then to introduce the speaker and start the.
Thank you, Arunima. Professor Arunima, Professor Devika, and friends, I consider this opportunity to chair the presentation to be made by Professor Devika as a matter of great privilege, because you know, she doesn't have to be introduced at all. She's I'm sure, to a crowd like ours, which has come here to listen to her. Her writings must be familiar already, and I don't want to go through the titles of her work. First of all, reading them out will itself take a whole lecture's time. What has impressed me with the work of Professor Devika is the new areas into which she dwells. She goes into spaces which is not normally tracked by social scientists of any variety, I mean, whoever they are, and also take positions in terms of new perspectives, new understandings, so much so that each of her writing, whether you agree with the findings or not, makes it extremely exciting to follow. I mean, and this is the characteristic of writings, which is practically, at the personal level, has greatly impressed me. I'm sure that each one of you will have your own understanding of works. She is, of course, very widely read, widely referred to, and all that. And today she will be talking about intersectional histories, reflections on the history of work from an urban slum in Kerala. I understand she is looking out for explanations for questions of equality and inequality in the world of work by basing herself on the history of work as it has evolved in a slum area or slum region of an urban slum region in Kerala. I'm sure that it will be as exciting as our earlier studies too. I would also, I also feel privileged because by way of age, at least I can claim to be a teacher of hers. Not that I've been a teacher of her in any formal class, but I suppose she won't object if I say that she was my student. So it's a great privilege for a teacher to listen to his own student, and certainly a student who surpasses the work that the teacher has ever done. So here is Professor Devika.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. And yes, for me, it is a great honor that you will be chairing this session. You forgot to mention you were my PhD examiner too. So I am indebted to you in many ways, more than one. Yes, and in this research, and I must say that in this research, I'm kind of taking up some of the leads, or at least trying to develop some of the themes that many people of your generation including you, I believe, at CDS, have expanded earlier. So this is actually trying to think about those themes using a different kind of methodology, and, and focusing on a microsite, not all of Kerala, but on a microsite, which is an urban slum in Trivandrum. And in this research, I have sought to probe into the intersection of spatial, caste, and gender power in shaping work and lives of the urban poor in contemporary Kerala. So that's been my general interest. My interest in this research was to try and think about how the experience of marginalization has changed post 1990s among different sections of the people. Part of this research was also a fishing hamlet in the Trivandrum coast. So the extent research on working class in this debate is largely structuralist, as we all know. So that is, scholars have emphasized structural economic change. So class relations and power are identified as central structures. And sometimes caste is acknowledged, but there is a way in which much of the scholarship, assume a certain isomorphism between caste and class. And with that assumption, they kind of set aside the need to examine the effects of caste as a structure. My aim here is to examine the manner in which these other structural aspects, specifically gender, caste, and spatiality, intersect with class to shape the histories of the urban working class in Kerala. And the recent press, I looked at the recent past as well. So it's not talking, in Kerala, there is the assumption that when we talk about the past, it must be before 1940s. So that's not the sense I'm trying to bring to the past here. So it's a fairly recent past is what I'm trying to look at. So this study is undertaken in the background of course, galloping inequalities in Kerala. We have a number of recent studies that find inequalities growing in both urban and rural context. And there is clear evidence that groups that were already disadvantaged in, when we were talking about the Kerala model itself, that phase, they have suffered actually more. However, there's much less attention paid in this literature to specific social contexts and disadvantages. So therefore, focusing on an urban slum seemed interesting to me. Additionally, while it seems clear that marginalized communities such as the Dalits and the fisher folk and the Adivasis have been much less able to defend petty production and access to natural resources, the urban poor may seem to be better off, especially because they are often the targets of recent urban development, new liberalized urban development, but nevertheless. For example, the Urban Basic Services Program of the 1990s. The Kudumbashree and what became the Kudumbashree was first actually tried out in the urban slums in the 90s. And then, of course, this was followed by the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, which for slum housing. In fact, the slum that I'm talking about was a beneficiary of all these different programs. So one might think that the urban poor would be better. And another important, but so I wanted to really find out if they're actually better. Another important context, of course, is the rapid urbanization that Kerala is undergoing, which scholars have remarked is quite different from in both its nature as well as its impacts from other regions in India. So Sri Kumar Chattopadhyay, for example, points out that the entire coastal area, plain and parts of midland have been transformed into a more or less homogeneous landscape of a single urban agglomeration with a series of nodes. And no, they do not also find any significant poverty reduction that is coming out of the urbanization. So, and of course, evenly increasing consumption has made waste dumping a very serious issue. And in fact, which affects the urban poor the most. And this is something that's coming out of a whole bunch of news reports from around 2005 onwards, which, however, I mean, the fact that waste dumping is a problem is acknowledged in Kerala, but the fact that waste dumping is actually a problem that is experienced more acutely by the urban poor is still to be acknowledged. And of course, we also know that the urban poor, while this is on the one side, the dominating discourse is about how the urban poor, especially the informal sector workers in urban areas in Kerala, have benefited hugely from the gains of the 20th century. So we are told that, of course, in the literature, we are told that in Kerala, the informal or unorganized sector workers in the 20th century were organized in unions, and this led to the breaking down of differences, very sharp differences between formal and informal sectors, and there have been innovative collective care arrangements like welfare funds, etc. Comes out of the literature, and that urban workers have benefited hugely from the labor militancy of from the late 40s to 70s. There have been significant rise in wages. All this is well documented. Only very recently have we even tried to talk about this issue that seems to be almost in the horizon, of waste dumping being the problem of the urban poor that affects the urban poor. But otherwise, we really don't see the urban poor as a disadvantaged group much. But I am trying to, that's one reason I thought I should look very closely at this site to just find out how things are. So what I did was to focus on the intersections of the histories of space, caste, and gender to understand the nature of marginalization in a deprived urban community. And this struck me from my everyday interactions of moving around the city. For example, if you get into an auto rickshaw and you tell the driver, as a woman that is, you get into an auto rickshaw and you tell the driver that you want to go to this particular slum, my experience is that the auto rickshaw driver turns back and stares at you as if you were asking to be taken to some really disreputable place. So clearly, whatever the urban poor may have gained, the stigma on the places of residence clearly has not gone. And this was good enough for me to do some research on the history of that area. So I tried to demand a closer understanding of secularized caste. That is the refurbishment of caste power within, both nationalist as well as developmentalist models, under which traditional justifications of caste inequalities are replaced by modern rationales, such as hygiene or culture or safety, etc., etc. And naturalized gender. So I'm trying to demand a closer look at how these work together. And by naturalized gender, I mean the underpinning of the male-female binary and its attendant spatial coordinates on biological foundationalism. My site is a city slum in Trivandrum. It's actually an illegal slum. It's a squatter colony, actually. Though they have the JNURRM housing has come there, so it's a kind of an ambiguous place now. But it was a squatter colony, and it is near the main market in Trivandrum and very close to the material symbols of the erstwhile Travancore kingdom. The East Fort and the Padmanabha Swami temple. It is a grade 1 slum, very small now, actually less than 11 acres. But in my research, it was much bigger. In my research, it seemed that in the 1930s, it was actually much bigger than that. Parts of it split off when people living there became more respectable. Now you have a very small area, around 11 to 12 acres maximum. And there is an old canal that used to run through this colony. It was a big canal. Originally, it was a big canal, and now it's barely like two meters. It's like just a big drain. But initially, I mean, in the memories of the oldest residents, it was a large one, at least 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep. So it was founded, this colony was founded in the 1930s. It's not a colony. well, they call it Karimadam colony, but it's not, I don't know the meaning. The word colony in Kerala is associated with slums now. So this colony was founded in the 1930s, and it has received several generations of welfare housing. In fact, since the 1960s, and it has around 2,341 residents, 632 families. The population density is 2,271 people per acre. So you can imagine how crowded it is. It's a terribly crowded place. And the households, very large proportion of households are female headed. And this colony, as I told you, has been supported in many ways. So they have electric connections, they have door numbers, they have water, though it's all, this colony is still a quarter colony, but still they do have electric connections, they have water connections, they have door numbers, and they are generally considered, at least until very recently, they were considered to be a great asset to the left in that area. But it was also a place that was known for drugs and illicit liquor till 1995 when it was banned. So it's supposed to be one of those places where respectable women don't go. So we had some trouble when we did field work there. Some of us who tried to go, we used to go there every day, were questioned on the road. So moral policemen are everywhere in Kerala. So some of us had those experiences at that time. And my methodology here is like, it was a three-phase research, of which one phase was entirely devoted to generating a local history. And I'm going to share my insights from that phase here. So it began with a field survey because we wanted to get a good sense of the population there. And from there, we kind of divided the population into 10 different, not 10, to age cohorts, different age cohorts of a gap of 10 years each. And then from each cohort, we chose a diverse set of interviewees, people who represented the diversity and the social diversity of the area quite well in each group. And then at a gap of 10 years, we devised questions. Most of them were the same questions, but also questions that were specific to the time periods we wish to cover. So we devised semi-structured interviews with these interviewees selected from these different age cohorts, and from their accounts we could then get a sense of how material life in that area changed in time. For example, the changes in the environment, the changes in infrastructure, the changes in work were traceable in time. And because I was specifically interested in the history of women's work, I had additional interviews with older women who continue to work even in their 70s and 80s. So from this account, so what I'm sharing about here is from this account, what came out of this exercise. So the earliest residents, this area was settled around 1930s. So before the 1930s, this area was a completely uninhabited, swampy, unhealthy kind of place. And it was also in some ways uncanny because it lay on the road from the East Fort to the burning ghat of the Brahmins of the fort. So it lay on that way. And on the way, in fact, abutting the road, there was a pond, and there is still a pond. There is a large pond, and on the side of which there used to be a pavilion. And behind it was a large wild area where some Dravidian idols were worshipped, like Yakshi and so on, Mardan and Yakshi and so on. People feared them. So nobody went there. It was a kind of an inhospitable, uncanny kind of place where the death rites of the dead Brahmins used to be performed. So apparently the last rites of the dead Brahmins used to be performed in this mandapam, including the shaving of the Brahmin widow's head and so on. So it was considered to be an inauspicious place. And because there were these other deities, etc., in this wild kind of place, nobody went there because it was supposed to be dangerous. This place was settled by the sanitation workers of the Trivandrum municipality. So when the Trivandrum, the Travancore government set up the sanitation department, they began, because it was impossible to find sanitation workers in Kerala, they began to import sanitation workers from Tamil Nadu, basically Tirunelveli. So groups of workers were brought to Trivandrum and hired by the municipal corporation. But Trivandrum was an extremely casteist city. So the city spaces where each area of the city was controlled by different castes, and these people had no place to go. They had no, unlike the Dalits who were settled in the colony around the agricultural areas, which were right in the middle of the city at that time. There were a different group of Dalits. Those were Malayali Dalits, but these were Tamil people who were brought in to do the city cleaning. They had no place to go except the swampy, uninhabitable, areas around water bodies. So even today, the major slums in Trivandrum are located around these water bodies. They're usually waterlogged, unhealthy, swampy places. So this particular slum is also one of them. They had wonderful stories on how they conquered the fear. How the first settlers conquered their own fears and settled in this area, cutting down the trees, clearing bushes, building small huts, and living there. So the first generation of settlers were these sanitation workers. In Malayalam, of course, we used to call them scavengers. In English, of course, they used to be called scavengers at that time. So they collected human excreta from house to house. So the working with the municipality did give them some symbolic capital because they used to wear a uniform, etc. But beyond that, at least until the 1940s, they had no rights, and living areas, etc. And in fact, they were subjected to extreme caste exclusion. Then in the 1940s came another, around the late 1930s and 40s came another a second set of migrants. And these were largely Muslim. In fact, I like to call them the refugees of caste and gender, because these families were evidently running away from their own relatives. Women who were running away from abusive husbands, bringing children to stay there. Women who were betrayed by, upper caste, masters, etc., from the countryside, coming with their children. Families, what should I say? Upper caste. In fact, there was one Nair family there, which was a couple who were abused by their uncle, brother sister actually, who ran away to live in this colony. So there is a generation like that. Then a third stream of basically workers whose work was stigmatized. In fact, those who came in the third stream included a lot of Muslim merchants, etc., who were actually quite well off and who were ruined by the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, who suffered huge losses and in fact pauperized, who came and settled in this colony and became headload workers. So in this third stream, there were also other kinds of stigmatized workers, butchers, leather workers, etc. And later, when the stigma on the craft of the butcher, the work of the butcher and the leather worker was, ended, that part of the colony separated. Now you still have the butcher shops very near these colonies, and the families of these butchers are also settled very close to the families, but there is a road that separates them, and they do not identify anymore with this space. So in the 1940s, this whole space, so it must have been at least 50 or maybe even 100 acres at that time. And now you have a very small space that continues to be identified as the colony. Now here, the first important form of production, petty production, that seems to have started was arak. Arak was distilled. And now the why it was distilled is also very interesting, because this was a necessity for people who worked as scavengers. This kind of work is almost impossible to perform without being drunk. Even today, there is plenty of research now that identifies alcoholism to be a very important evil that plagues the lives of manual scavengers in India. And the reason is that you just cannot work without that kind of heavy drinking. So, and the women apparently set up the arak production there for the men who did this work. But then very soon, this the news of this was reached the city, and so the market expanded from it was a small embedded market within the slum, and this market burst out of that social setting, and customers began to come from around the city, and it soon became one of the most important places of illicit arak production. And so a nexus involving the police, local politicians, etc., evolved around arak as an industry there in time. The men there worked as I told you, the Muslim men. So the men there worked either in the city corporation as workers, scavengers, and later sanitation workers. And the men worked largely as head loaders in the Chalai market, which is very close to this area. Now, and I tried to ask women about their enterprises. Of course, the arak production was most commonly spoken about. But they also mention other household enterprises, and the female household enterprise became particularly prominent after 1960. Now, 1960 is a kind of landmark in the history of this place, because at that time, 100 families of sanitation workers were removed to another colony. In fact, that's the first state provided housing for Dalits in Kerala to a place called MSK Nagar. And all that space that remained was taken up largely by the Muslim poor. So this colony is right now a Muslim majority colony. It's after that the women started engaging in various kinds of enterprises, but petty shops, petty trade in textiles, cooked food, renting out various kinds of materials for fees, etc. And of course, arak selling, and all these petty trades have thrived there. In fact, arak thrived there until the mid 1990s, when it was banned. So the work history here shows that women's work option, I mean, to put it very generally, if you look at the work options, how they have changed across time, there is a clear indication of decline of work options. So before this area was completely settled, there was a great deal of vegetation here. So a lot of coconut trees, a lot of screw pine trees, bushes, and so on. So women made a living out of these, like for example, making thatches out of coconut leaves and selling them, making brooms and selling them, making screw pine mats and baskets, etc. They also went to the market, recycled the mats and baskets from the market. So in the market, packaging was largely in terms of screw pine mats and baskets. Those were retrieved, the ones that the traders threw away, were retrieved, brought back into the colony, turned into new products and sold. By the end of the 1970s, these women were collecting and sorting waste, and clearly incomes were falling from this. Another important kind of work the women did was to collect the spilt grain, spilt grain and pulses and lentils and chili, coriander, all of this would spill off from gunny bags. So the women would collect this waste, the spilt, not waste, sorry, spilt food, sort them, clean them, and resell them for a lower price. So it's another kind of work women did. Then I told you that a big canal ran through the colony, and there was a pond, and the canal ran through the pond right through the colony. Every year, in fact, this place was notorious for flooding. So, but then the floods did not stay. You know, the floods came and they immediately left, leaving behind a lot of clay. So women made bricks. In fact, there's one woman who told me that for 20 years, she had a steady income from just making bricks from the clay that was left each time the canal, during the monsoon, the canal would rise. And then in the 2 monsoons, there would be deposits of clay from which bricks could be made and sold. And however, that stopped in the 1970s, because towards the end of the 1970s, the middle class housing colonies that came around, that were settled around this area, all their grey water was now discharged into this canal, which meant that all the grey water from these houses began to reach the colony. So this area began, until then, you know, you get this impression of a village by the river kind of a impression. I mean, from the accounts of these people, you get the impression of a village by, you know, the canal, people swimming in the canal, catching fish, washing their clothes. So in some ways, actively interacting with the water. And then from the 1970s, there is a break. And this break happens when the grey water from the residential colonies, the middle class residential colonies around this area began to be released into the canal. This meant that a lot of dirt, polluting dirt, began to reach the canal. So urban waste is not a recent problem, clearly, for the urban poor. It dates back right from the 1970s. Now, the women told me that before this grey water began to get worse and worse, they used to plant vegetables around the pond because the alluvium, the deposits were very rich. So the vegetable yields used to be very high, even without any manuring. They used to raise ducks in the pond, but when the canal and pond got badly polluted, this was no longer possible. And also, there were wild patches around the pond from which they would collect the colocasia leaves, which used to be the packaging for the meat sellers. So chambala, you know, was cut and sold. So interviewees could clearly recollect when particular products began to lose demand. For example, they told me that by the mid-1990s, patches were no longer in demand. The screw pine mats were not in demand almost from the 1980s. And new packaging in the market meant that spilt grain and spilt food was no longer there for them to collect. So you see a steady decline in work options for women. However, if you compare it to the men, things are very different. So male occupations did not become very diverse, but they grew more steady and lucrative. And this was due to extremely effective unionization of the sanitation workers and the headload workers. They held very, very effective strikes between the 1950s and the 1960s. And these successes, of course, should be viewed in the larger political context of the mid-20th century, in which assetless workers and petty producers, the traders, and those operating in the illicit economy had very strong mutual connections. And the left, of course, had a very strong anti-statist kind of welfarist rhetoric, in which the entitlements granted by the post-colonial developmentalist state was interpreted as people's rights, you know, not just entitlements. And this was a time when the left openly challenged bureaucracies. It tested the limits of legality when it came to welfare, to claiming welfare entitlements on behalf of the poor. So the empowerment of the male worker in Karimadam should be read in that broad context. And these workers also monopolized work in head loading in the Chala market. And in fact, some of the studies in the 1980s actually show that they earned higher than even minor government employees at that time. So, but then after the 1990, this militant kind of left hegemony and this discourse of the proletariat began to wane. So material gains of headload workers did not, however, shrink a lot, you know. So in even despite the fact that this Kerala labor policy of 2001 and the Kerala Loading and Unloading Act of 2002 sought to rein in the workers, the headload workers, they really did not lose a lot from direct government intervention. They lost because of certain other kinds of changes that were happening in all kinds of market places in Kerala. Deep trading, for example, happening for a host of reasons, including changes in transport, changes in packaging, cell phones, supermarkets coming up. So that was what caused deep trading, and that affected the workers, but definitely not. It was not the government that cracked down on them directly. And these changes in the markets only affected the older generation of men. The younger men in the slums found more and more new jobs here. So they worked as commission agents, for example, canvassing agents. You just needed to know to have speaking Tamil, Malayalam, English, some English, and you didn't need a formal degree for this. Fewer work hours, more pay, it was more flexible, and so the men in Karimadam, younger men in Karimadam, actually gained from these new opportunities in the market. And of course, some of these jobs actually border on criminality. So some of them are kind of, well, you could say extortion agents for, various kinds of usurious, money lenders, etc. Some actually steal vegetables, etc. So you might find these heaps of vegetables in certain parts of town on some days where they sell really cheap. Usually those are stolen from wholesalers. So, and they make, and it's good money. You make good money out of it. So the men there, so this explained something that we had seen in Karimadam very strongly. Like, for example, I remember one of the first things that really struck me when I went into this place for the first time is in a house where I was going to interview somebody, there's a clothes line. And on the clothes line, there were these fancy branded male clothing on the one side, all, looking really spruce and new, all branded stuff. On the other side, you had these really pathetic looking female clothing, all, washed out colors. I mean, looking old and tattered and washed out. So this struck me, here. I mean, I was really struck by this sight, and I didn't know how to explain it because clearly the incomes were not high. Now, this explained it because young men are actually making a fairly good income. It is the women there who are not earning anything. In fact, the only, when we tried to find out what are the kind of jobs that women began to do in the 1990s and so on, we found that women were still stuck in very low paid, low skilled work. So, for example, some trades like which they had been practicing since the 1960s, which they could have turned into lucrative, with the help of Kudumbashri, etc., have still not. Like, for example, they are the biggest producers of jackfruit chips in the city. So contractors for local bakeries bring these jackfruits there for the women to prepare and fry. Now, this job could have maybe taken up, Purnamashri could have, taken this up and turned it. But there are other reasons why women found it almost impossible to work together as groups there. So then and women told us that some kinds of work which had lasted right into the 90s began to actually disappear for them once new facilities were introduced. For example, water carrying was a lucrative job for many women till around even 2007. That is, water was not readily available, so some women volunteered to carry water from wherever it was available to houses on a regular basis for a regular payment. Now that disappeared in 2007 when taps were brought closer. Then there was the job of shopping for families, like everyday shopping. There were women who shopped on a daily basis for families. When the shops and supermarkets came closer to the colony, this also vanished. Then the sorting and cleaning of waste, of course, has remained more or less steady. So, in fact, in 1980s, I mean, the remuneration is not much, and the dangers are much more. So, in early 1980s, a woman got ₹5 a day for sorting glass bottles from collected waste. So in 2002, her daughter, who sorted waste, got ₹150 a day, but she had to handle all kinds of toxic and hazardous things. Domestic work is what has actually increased a lot in the colony, but these women are suffer greatly from the stigma of being from there. So employers pay them less wages if they know that they come from this place, so they have to conceal their identities, and they prefer to work in places that are far off. So there is a huge negative trade-off here. If they want to work, they have to go far away. And young women, young educated women from this colony also find it very difficult to find employment in service sector industries, because service sector places, because the service sector, particularly the entertainment industry, the hospitality industry, requires a certain feminine docility, which the women in Karimadam are supposed to not have. Now that is a prejudice, but that is a very entrenched prejudice, a stigma, that is. So this means that the women here are extremely, very highly dependent on their husbands, and very, very subservient to them. In fact, in a situation tougher than what their mothers endured. Because the mothers, remember, had their own enterprise. The arak making was a huge enterprise there. So, and one trade that seems to have caught up is tailoring. And tailoring was introduced there by the well-known trade unionist Juba Ramakrishna Bulla, who organized the scavengers in Travancore first. He introduced tailoring as a craft that would, raise people to respectability, because after all, a tailor has to measure. In his imagination, it was something that would break untouchability, because you go to a tailor, you have to let the tailor touch you, right? So he introduced a large number of women in this colony in the 1940s to tailoring, and that seems to have been passed on from generation to generation. And only very recently has an NGO utilized these skills, and they have come up with a brand called Karimadam. Please go online. They have an online shop. It's called Modest Fashions. Everybody can wear those fashions. They have an online shop called Karimadam. The brand is Karimadam. So if you are planning to do any clothes shopping, please buy the Karimadam brand kurtis, etc. They're very nice, by the way. But this is a very recent development, like in 2-3 years past. Now, some of the women have migrated, but the women who migrated have borne enormous stigma. Some of them have been to Bombay and Dubai. In Bombay, they have worked as bar girls and come back with money, but that money continues to stigmatize. Even though their money, they are still they are still stigmatized. Though, of course, they don't, these are not women who will bend under the stigma or so on. But nevertheless, it's very clear that any attempt to migrate as a single woman is looked upon with disdain. And the most respectable work that women could aspire for here was essentially development work. And development work has been partly available there to women since the 1960s, since the Mahila Samajam of the 1960s, which was set up in 1960. It was controlled by a powerful Dalit woman, actually, now associated with the Congress. So it offered literacy classes and dance classes and so on. But then the local women did not benefit much, though working there was always considered to be respectable. Now, this often set the respectable development workers against the arak makers, and this kind of contradiction came to a head in the 1990s, when the Urban Basic Service Program and the earlier Percussor of the Kudumbashri, etc., were implemented in this colony, where there was a group of, because you see, the problem with arak industry is that almost every house there had some connection or the other with arak making. Now, the market each is a producer, and each is in competition with the other. This means that there is no social peace at all, everyone is competing against each other. So, there are constant, so your competitor will inform the police if you have, if you have larger number of customers, and then there are constantly raids on you. There are all kinds of, all kinds of strategies being put into place constantly, to deal with competition. So there was no social peace in that area. And the young women there, the young women of the 1980s and 1990s, who were also educated, who had gone to school and who were much more educated than their mothers, began to feel a tremendous sense of anger and resentment against this whole setup. So they became when they, in the 1990s, it's these young women who became development workers, and they did everything in their power to crack down on illicit liquor, especially after it was banned in 1994. So this set that younger generation of the 1990s against the older generation. The arak by the way, the arak production was a very lucrative job. So the women I interviewed, and all of them senior, like aged at that time between 75 and 90. So those women told me very clearly that they had raised huge families with just this. All their daughters were given good dowries and settled outside Karimada. So, mobility came from that. Sons were bought lorries, taxis, or, various kinds of vehicles, or settled in various trades, and, or, encouraged to do usury, whatever, but settle outside the colony. So these women, the surpluses that came from arak production, so many of them told us that they sold milk in the morning. They also had, they invested the surplus in milch cattle, goats and milch cattle. So they sold milk in the morning and arak in the evening. So like that. And some of them bought job cards for the son-in-laws. Job cards are the cards that the headload workers have to work in the markets, which are highly tradable item, valuable tradable item. So they bought job cards for son-in-laws so that they could have a steady income from the market. And this tension actually continues even today. Even now, this tension between that older generation, which got by through arak production and actually gained upward mobility, at least their children gained upward mobility through them, and the development workers who still, unfortunately, have not moved an inch. Now, this is something that came out very starkly in the research, because the generation of development workers of the 1990s have not made any kind of gains in terms of upward mobility. Some of them were celebrated in the press as models of, some as evidence for what Kudumbashree can do, as what the literacy program can do. Beyond that, they have not moved. In fact, the saddest thing is a story of a family of three. The grandmother was somebody who ran away from a feudal lord in Kollam district because he was trying to sexually abuse her. She came to Karimadam. She migrated here. She bought land here at that time and set up her hut. Then managed to get into the sanitation workers union. She worked as a sanitation worker. Her daughter also became, that is my interviewee's mother, was also a sanitation worker. But she was then, of course, by that time, she was no longer a scavenger. She was a sanitation worker with full rights, the pension, with many other benefits, and anyway, a steady pension. So she's a second generation. The third generation, we thought this one is this one has, my interviewee had completed her high school, and she was a well-known social worker long before Kudumbashree. She was very prominent in the literacy in the literacy campaign of the early 1990s. Then she became a very prominent figure in the UBSP and the subsequent self-help group work. And she was also known quite well in political circles. She was well connected in political circles. But her story is very long, but to cut it short, it ended up with the government giving her, the left government, giving her a job in the medical college. As what? As a cleaner. So and it ended up being a temporary job. It was a very ill-paid, extremely laborious work that she used to do in the medical college. And anyway, that job was not permanent. So the High Court ordered all of them to be dismissed, and basically ordered the government to appoint from the PSC list. So she lost that job. So, she found herself in a place that was much worse compared to her mother. So the elderly women actually tell us how they settle their daughters outside, the elderly women, the arak makers. So it is difficult to see how development work helped women at all. Now, one important reason why the women who aspire to this kind of reforming the place didn't succeed is the spatial abjection of Karimadam, which I just mentioned. So as I told you, it was this really wild, scary kind of place, which was actually, occupied by people with a number of strategies. However, it was associated with illicit liquor, as I told you, so not considered to be a good place to go and so on. But despite that, in the 1960s, there were some civil associations that the people there tried to form. So some of them tried to form what is called the Karimadam Kudigidappa Sangham. And that Sangham, that civil society organization, tried to provide some amenities and manage common resources, and it actually failed. And it's a kind of a textbook case that shows how these so-called self-help organizations for the poorest will not work. The civil society for the poor is a very expensive and difficult venture to sustain. Then in the 1980s, of course, they came under the patronage of a very powerful CPM leader who managed to connect them, give them a lot of benefits, including electricity connections, water connections, etc. And they continued. Basically, this slum was supposed to be his, his personal fiefdom for a long time. And this place continued to be, despite the fact that they came under this leader's protection. The stigma was quite has not declined, and we have seen that stigma resurface in the 1990s as well. With all this work, though these women worked very hard to clean this place of Arak. So imagine the irony of it, In order to clean this place, they had to give up their major source of income, which is through Arak production. And with the decline of left militancy and the discourse of the proletariat and so on, the head loaders of this place are now being projected as gundas and thugs, the usual. So there is this peculiar paradox you can see there. Very high, you find that there is, this area receives a lot of state support in terms of resources, but you find there is no mobility there. Men seem to be earning a lot, but there is no mobility, and except through marrying out. So the women have to be marrying out, the men have to be having a place outside. So now it is a common strategy for the inhabitants of this place who have a marriageable son or daughter to move out for a couple of years. So they settle somewhere else for a couple of years, get their children married, and then move back into the colony. So this is happening. So just to conclude, I want to conclude now. So what is the relevance of this kind of historical research to the contemporary crisis of history as disciplinary knowledge? That's where I want to conclude. Now, we all know that the history is granted centrality in the project of nation building. And this has made it into a site of violent conflict, and the right wing as a force tries to monopolize the narrative. I think we need to combat this. Yeah, and I totally respect how people are fighting. But I also think that we need to find other escape routes that will loosen the tie between history and the nation. Now, I think what is important is to remember that history is not just a discipline, it is also a perspective. I mean, a perspective that takes the time, the axis of time, very seriously in studying social change. And so therefore history is, in this sense, history is relevant not just as a discipline, And it is relevant that all kinds of knowledge, it can be, you can produce historical knowledge of all kinds of objects located in all kinds of disciplines. So in some ways, I'm bringing to bear my training here as a historian to make sense of present issues pertaining to economic inequalities and social divides in a microsite. And I think the way to do that is by focusing on the intersections of the different axes of power. And by doing this, I'm hoping to free, to assert the fact that history maybe should escape into other disciplines. It has already escaped, I know that. But maybe it's time to remember that once more. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devika. As usual, your presentation as well as the topic that you discussed was quite interesting, and I'm sure that much more can be discussed, and there would be queries and questions from different perspectives, particularly when you use history to explain a concrete, living, actual situation available in our society. Now, what I will do is that I'll hand over the meeting to Professor Arunima, so she can moderate it and and get the questions made and all that. So, will you kindly take over?
Yes,
Arunima?
yes, Michael. Yes, thank you. Thanks so much, Devika. That was absolutely wonderful, and just what we expect from you. I did want to mention to you that I have actually used a part of this in something that I've written. You've done a paper from this. So I found that, and I've used a part of this, especially the reference to Juba Ramarshman and so on. So this is absolutely, and what can I say? It's really important work. It's very relevant. And there are, I think, enormous ways of sort of using this kind of insight to move back and also think with the kinds of, the absences in the archive. And that's where oral histories and the kinds of testimonies you've collected become so relevant. But I will save my remarks for later. I do want to make a quick announcement to all our sort of friends who are here, which is that what helps us to keep this seminar series more time efficient and so that the speaker can get more questions is if you would type in your questions into the chat box and I will read it out for the speaker and then she can take it one by one. And I think there are already 2 questions that have come, Devika, so let me read that out to you. One is from Jaya Nair, who says, wonderful presentation, thank you. How has educational opportunities been available and made use of or not among the generation there?
Shall I? Okay.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how when we did our primary survey, we did it, of course, of 3 generations in every household. And interestingly, among Muslim households particularly, the oldest generation was the best educated. Many of them had reached the 10th standard, of the 1940s, by the way. And these were people who could recite Malayalam poetry, who could speak, whatever is associated with highly educated. So there was this 80-year-old woman who would discuss Karuna with me. Kumar Nashan's Karuna with me at length. So these were people who had lost their wealth and then they moved because they were pauperized, moved to this colony. The second generation is the worst off. They are the ones who have least educational opportunities. The third generation, yes, is improving, but their skills are much less. The second generation, even if they didn't go to school, they still could read and write and so on. Third generation has actually, a lot of them have completed high school. Some of them have gone to college, but they continue to be, I mean, at the level of skills, etc., they're still not as good as their grandparents or parents. In third
Thank you.
generation, of course, though there are college going students, they still are, many of them work in the service sector where you don't need, like for example, some of these young men you will find in the new cinema theaters, cinema halls in the malls. In fact, some of them are working in the malls. uh, those are not places where you need a college degree, but that's the only place they have been able to find a job.
Thank you, Devika.
Meenakshi.
Meenakshi Senan. Her question is, what are the views of these women on feminism? How inadequate do they find the feminism of the Savarna women?
Well, they are far away from feminism, so not even one of them even discussed feminism with us. Um, so, I mean, feminism is not in their lives at all. No kind of feminism. That is. Or the only feminism that is part of their lives is the governmentalized feminism of the Kurumbashri and so on. So, which is, of course, we know a certain uh, version of liberal feminism. That so much they agree, but not beyond that. Across the
Then,
years, have the people who moved
sorry.
out remained home? Well, the children of the arak bakers are all very respectably settled. I had a chance to go to one of these houses of a daughter of one of the biggest usurers. I mean, she's like the biggest usurer in that colony is an 82-year-old woman. Her daughter lives near the Atagal temple, and it's a big house, actually, quite a big house. 12 cents of land, property, and a house. Her husband is a school teacher. Hmm. And the children go to all these fancy schools. So I asked and she's the youngest daughter, of course. She had older daughters. So I asked this lady if she didn't want to go and stay with her daughter. She said absolutely not. And I asked her why. She said, "You see, I cannot communicate with my grandchildren. My grandchildren all go to these fancy schools and all that. So I don't know English. I don't even know proper Malayalam. So they find me inconvenient. So I don't go." So it's clear that the ones who have gained upward mobility don't come back. There's one family I know who used to who told me, very senior people, all, by the way, senior CPM activists, husband and wife. I mean, who were in the party since the 1940s. Now they live alone. The man has lost his eyesight. It's a tough thing. No, the lady is senior, very senior. They still live alone, and they have two daughters, both of who are married to police officers, and they live in very respectable situations outside the colony. They don't visit their parents, they send food packets. So it's not as if the children cut off from the colony, but they keep those associations very secret, some way or the other. Janaki?
Shall I read out the next question? There's a follow-up question from Jaya, which is, across the years, have the people who moved out remained out, or do they come back?
That's what I'm saying. That's what I just answered. No?
Ah, okay.
They do come back, but they conceal that they belong here.
All right. Okay. So the next question is from Jinu. And the question is intersections history and patristic history the one and all the same, ma'am?
No, by intersectional history, what I meant is that you do not assume the centrality of one structure. You assume that history is, usually the idea is to imagine one central structure. If it is working class, then you talk about, class. If it is if women, you will centralize gender. Instead of doing that, you assume that depending on very local context, very particular context, specific context, you will have a set of structures, not just one. You will have a number of structures that shape each other. And the job of the historian would be then to identify these structures and identify those intersections through which the local, the social life of that area is shaped. That's what I mean by intersectional history. Yes. That's a little different from, say, interdisciplinary history and so on.
Janaki Abraham. Hi, Janaki. Okay, so her question is, thank you so much for an extremely rich paper. My question is, what are the kinds of spatial divisions within this colony of 11 acres? Are there caste divisions visible in these spatial divisions?
No, Janki, what is really interesting is this is one of the places where there's a large occurrence of intermarriage. You know, the Dalit Muslim marriages are plenty. In fact, the women are trapped because, as I told you, without a huge dowry, they cannot be married out. Hmm? At the same time, young men in this colony start earning very early, as I told you. Like by the time they're 22, they're earning like, say, 2,000 rupees for working 3 hours at night. Hmm? So they have a lot of money. So what you find is that marriage, girls who live in the colony who are not, whose parents cannot just afford to marry them out. And I told you this is very largely female-headed households. So very few women really have and now it's, as I told you, in the earlier generation when women distilled arak, they could still marry their children out, but now it's impossible. So the intermarriage is very common, and so also is desertion. So when a 21-year-old marries a 14-year-old, and by the way, this is quite common, huh? 15-year-old, 14-year-old, uh, then you have to expect desertion. In another 6 years, this marriage breaks up, and this girl is another single mother left in this colony. So there are caste divisions are not visible, though of course, as I told you, in 1960, when 100 sanitation workers were given houses in MSK Nagar, this became a predominantly Muslim colony, but that did not cause any internal spatial divisions. But around, in fact, if you look at the colony, on the external level, you will see a lot of new kinds of divisions coming up. Now, for example, the one spatial division I mentioned was around work. When butchering became respectable, when the craft of butchering and leather work became respectable, that part of the colony split off. That is sometime in the 1960s or something, split off, and it became a different. Now you don't associate it with the colony at all. In fact, the people on that side of the road, if you even mention it to them, are offended. While at one time they were quite part of this. So that's how the spatial divisions within the colony have evolved. And now, of course, you have the new housing. So a lot of the earlier areas, the big division is between the new housing and the old housing. But that is being, steadily, that's changing. So you have new housing coming up there.
Thanks. The next is from Lena Abraham. Very rich presentation. Has the land price increased in this colony? Are there new migrants to this area?
This is an interesting thing about once you had this, the UBSP and then later the housing coming up, the Genrum housing. Once that happened and the beneficiary list began to drop, the city corporation gave them an ultimatum that they should not accept any new migrants. Earlier, for the poor who came to the city, one of these colonies was their refuge. Now, that is absolutely out of the question because the new housing rules are very strict. New migrants are not allowed. In fact, there is pressure on the locals in the colonies to prevent migrants from settling down because that means an additional liability to the city corporation. The city corporation will have to provide a home for yet another person. So they don't allow it. anymore. The land prices, yes, actually a land market has been present almost from the 1940s. In fact, there are women who, grandmothers, women who remembered their grandmothers, the price at which the grandmothers bought the land at that time, along with a small and setting up, because housing was not a problem, because once you bought the land, your neighbors also helped you to build a hut, and building a hut was not very difficult at that time. But land prices have steadily increased. In fact, in one of the disputes that we were witness to was about between the city corporation and a man who had invested 4 lakhs. He had managed to migrate to the Gulf, and his 4 lakh savings he had invested in buying out some of his neighbors. Remember, this is a squatter colony, so there are no title deeds, etc., though they have door numbers, etc., etc. So land prices have gone up. So he bought up that 2 or 3 houses around, tiny, I mean, 2 cents of land, 1 cent of land for around 4 lakhs. So obviously land prices have gone up even in this informal land market. Then self-help groups.
Yeah, it's Jaya's follow-up question again. The question is, you talked about the failure of self-help groups who tried to help. Will you please share your views on why?
No, first of all, you see this, there is, as I told you, this is a place where these are extremely poor people. So, the struggle to share resources is much higher. Generosity is, if you ask me, generosity is very often an elite virtue. It's something that is possible because you have extra resources to share. But when the resources are not much, and there are many people to share, the tensions, it's not impossible, but to manage a group becomes much more difficult. That was one important reason. A second important reason is that they have no space. We found that women cooperated in micro enterprises much better in a place where they had space, like in the fishing hamlet where we did this similar kind of research. We found that women had a plenty of space to dry fish, to mend nets, to do all kinds of activities. But this is not a place where you have any space to build a group, to do something that is significant. So that is, and thirdly, of course, control. Like for the extremely poor people, they cannot risk a lot. For example, taking over the jackfruit business would need a lot of hand holding, massive support. Because for the women, if they lose their contractors, whatever the work contractors are giving them, and if they don't succeed, it is suicide. So they think whether they can, and the husbands, as I told you, the control by the men is extremely high, very high. So if by any chance they lose what they invest, it's a risk that is too much for them to take. That's why they don't invest. So Akhila, yeah.
So, thanks.
I know.
Morning to everyone. It's Thank you for the wonderful presentation. How was your experience moving in and out of the space? What are the tensions you experienced? I think you mentioned moral policing going in, but I also remember you mentioning how welcoming the people themselves were towards you.
Yeah, Akhila was at CDS at the time we were doing this field work, and I was talking non-stop about it at the time. I remember to students and everybody. I think, but this was very interesting, Akhila. I remember I was taken there by an auto rickshaw man who continuously warned me that I should not go there myself. Don't go, don't meet people. But when I went there, I found myself warmly welcomed, warmly to the point of eerie. Like I did not understand why I was welcomed so warmly. Everyone gave me food. People insisted that I should have lunch in their houses. So after the second day, when things started looking really strange, I plucked up the courage to ask a senior lady why they thought why they wanted me, why they wanted to feed me, all of them. And she looked at me surprised, and she said, "Oh, you must be the niece of so and so, which is that particular leader, that CPM leader, he's a he's a Nair, he's a Nair man in that locality, local. I mean, he belongs to one of the very prominent Nair families in that area. So we thought that you are this Nair's niece. You look. And I said, oh my God. I said, that kind of threw me. So then she said, you look alike. You look a lot like him. You actually look a lot like him. And I was very disappointed because this gentleman looks like some kind. Have you seen this Angry Birds game? Have you seen those piglets? This man is like that, a huge fat man. So I was most disappointed that I looked like him. But then she also said something else. She said, you know what? It's not just the physical resemblance, it's the way you walk into this place. You walk here as if you own it. That, I thought, told me hell of a lot about privilege, because I think the thing about people who are not marginalized in Kerala, people who are in the center, we generally think that we are entitled to walk in anywhere, right? So our body language, I mean, what Bourdieu calls bodily excess, I think that struck her. So, so this resemblance she saw between me and the Nair communist leader who has dominated that place is probably not just a physical resemblance. It's the very same bodily hexes that we both carry, and that is of caste, of course. So thank you for asking that question, Akila. This is important, I think.
Thank you. The
Shoma.
next question is Shoma Chaudhary Lahiris. It's thank you for your paper. Why do you think the developmental workers are stuck, although they are educated and have political consciousness, as part of the Kudumbashri or being under the patronage of the left leaders, etc.?
Well, see, the thing is, these workers are caught in the middle of, well, they can't do any serious livelihood work, because they have to devote time to community organization. They also have to be under the bidding of political leaders and so on. In fact, they took the huge biggest brunt of all the terrible mess that went on in that colony over housing. So they were blamed for everything, while they had to do the day-to-day running around. These women had to do all the time. And you know that I'm quite sure you know how poorly they're paid. This is such important work, but Kudumashri leaders are not paid anything. Community organizers are paid a pittance, while the kind of work they do is enormous. And I must say that unless, for Kudumashri workers, unless they get into local politics, they are not, I mean, their empowerment is extremely, not only is it peripheral, it is also very ephemeral. The moment you fall out of favor with some leaders, etc., or with the Kudumashri bureaucracy, that's the end of it. So again, Kudumashri is excellent for the among the low middle class. In Kerala, Kudumashri has proved to be a great vehicle of, at least to a large extent, at least, a vehicle of empowerment for women of the lower middle class, not of women who are stuck in a spatially stigmatized place like Karimadam. I'll never forget an interview I had with a woman leader of the Kudumbashi. This was for some other research. She's a head, she used to head, she used to be the chairperson of one of the CDSs in the Community Development Societies of the Trivandrum City Corporation. A Nair woman who told me that she was very ambitious, and like she wanted to be in politics, but her parents married her off after she finished her pre-degree. And then she's waited all these years. She's 45. She was 45 when I interviewed her. She said she wanted to be in politics. And so her husband passed away, and then she took that chance to enter politics. And she told me about her ambitions of getting into it. And then she said, then I asked her about her Kudumbashri, her innings in Kudumbashri. She has been there since the late 90s. So she said, yeah, I came into Kudumbashree, and she mentioned a certain bureaucrat who had, recruited her and all that. And then I asked her, but there was this earlier generation. Kudumbashree was piloted in the city, in cities in Kerala, in the slums. So I mentally, I was thinking of this other person whom I had met who I knew well in Karimadam. She was a chairperson for many, many years before it was scaled up in Kerala. So I asked her, what about those women who set up Kudumbashree in Trivandrum? They are all from the city slums. Oh, she said, that time, Kudumbate Parana Penangalonum Varathillairunnu idile. Which means respectably born women would not be part of this, because it was all these slum women in it. So you're talking about a time when only the non-respectable women would be part of Kudumbashree. All of that changed in 98. All that changed when it was scaled up. Then respectable women could also come. So that's why I came after her. So very clearly the stigma is so normalized. So development workers who are from these slums still don't stand a chance of upward mobility. There was a time when I knew this girl from the literacy campaign of 1991. I remember having interviewed her then, as a student myself in Trivandrum. And I remember thinking at that time that this girl is going to become the first woman leader from a slum in Kerala. Nothing of that sort happened. So in fact, the poor in the women from urban slums are perhaps the most stigmatized in Kerala.
Thank
So
you.
I
There
think
are some appreciative remarks. Okay, so Janaki has a follow-up. She says, contrary to your suggestion that there is no mobility in the area, what I found fascinating was the description of clothes hanging up in a house, a sign of the disparate earnings of women and men. It seems then that men have much greater chances of economic mobility, and men deserting their wives and families also points to the greater geographical mobility men have. Can
yeah,
you
now
then
I'm
say something
yeah.
about why you end with the statement of on no mobility?
No, I was saying no mobility for women. I didn't say no mobility for men. The men obviously have all this, but by the way, the men also don't leave this place. Many of them who have, there are a lot of men who have chosen to stay back also, though they also have wives outside. So I know men whose mothers are in Karimadam, but whose wives have houses in the local colonies outside. So they live in both places. They live with on normal basis, they are identified outside with those men. The only women who have gained mobility, as I mentioned, are the ones who have been married out with big dowries. So that's it. And the men are also not mobile through education. Not many educated men. They mostly are mobile because many of their trades are earning well even without education. So for women, I think education is going. I mean, there has to be some. Kudumbashree has to be, more. I think focused, and strategies have to be planned with the local shape of marginalization in mind, maybe. So I would think that there are young women I met who are extremely good students who could have been offered higher education, support for higher education and better education outside, and maybe that's the way to go. I don't know.
There's a follow-up from Jaya, but before I read her question out, could I request Michael to come in? And if there's a question that you have, Michael, would you like to come in now? And then I can follow up after you with Jaya's question. And if there's
Uh,
anything else.
no, I'm not planning to make any point because, not that I don't have any point, but, I thought, can be discussed elsewhere. And, you go ahead and uh, you can practically sum it up.
No, Jaya Nair has a follow-up. It says one more
Yeah,
question if time permits, and time does permit. We do
it is
have half an
desertion.
hour more.
Yes, it is
Uh,
desertion.
you
It is
met,
desertion.
but
Yes.
for the sake of others, you mentioned most houses were women-centric. Is it due to desertion of her husband?
Yeah, this is female headed. I don't say women centric, but It's female-headed households, and yes, it is desertion. And part of the reason, as I told you, is that they marry very young, and it's, I wouldn't blame. I mean, it's nobody's fault, that is, because you marry at 20 or 21 as a young man, and the girl is barely like 16 or 17. You're obviously still growing, right? So the assertion is something, but then it weighs much heavily on the woman because she's the one who ends up holding the babies. In one case, I know a girl who was 14, who ran away and got married at 14. By the time she was 19, she had three babies. She gave up all three. I mean, but she, I think, I mean, according to her Malayali morality, she's a horrible sinner. But I wouldn't call her that. She got a job in Bombay, some I don't know what kind of job, but she found that lucrative. So she gave up those three children to a home, and she left. Anyway, she didn't abandon the children. She gave them up to a home for adoption, and she left.
That's only fair. There's a question from Atida Sunil. Ma'am, what about the political participation among those people? Is there any relationship between their social status and political engagements?
I told you it was a predominantly left area. Long history of trade unionization. But also now you have the post-Babri Masjid Muslim organizations trying to make a dent there. Uh, but social status and political. Well, one reason why they have received so much of welfare, state welfare, is because of their political engagement for sure. It has changed over the decades. As I told you, I mean, the idea that areas like an urban slums don't have civil society is wrong. There was an effort to build a civil society in the 1960s, which collapsed because the people were too poor to sustain it. And then in the 1970s is when you have something that resembles the Chatterjeean political society taking shape there, where you have a political leader who is getting people basic, where people are bargaining with him to get basic facilities like water supply and power, electric power, and as well as door numbers, etc. That's very evident. But then that is failing. And by the time we were doing field work, it was evident that this protector could not protect them much. In fact, these people were being expected to adapt to the new regime of neoliberalized welfare. So through self-help and all that, they were really struggling. On the other hand, you had the post-Babri Masjid formations were beginning to have an influence, especially among the younger crowd. So that's the political situation there.
Then there's a question again from Jinu, which is what is post feminism, ma'am?
But let's discuss that separately. I don't think
I know
it is
it's not
relevant
really.
for this talk.
I was going to say that, but then I thought it's a question to you, and you should decide. Um, I have a question, Devika, which is, did you go in when you began doing this work? Did you go in with certain kinds of assumptions, and what was it that your time of field work? How did those kinds of assumptions change? What is it about the context of doing this kind of work in Varimadam? How did it change the ways in which you analyze this and your thing? Did it make you rethink intersectionality, for example? Were there certain, because many of us have certain kinds of
Yeah, I
ideas
know.
about
Yeah.
so
I
what
went
is it
in.
about material
Yeah,
that
I
makes
went
you?
in with the standard idea of intersectionality that we all have, caste, class, gender. Hmm.
Yeah.
But once I was in the field, I could see that these are only very broad sketches. Hmm. I could see, for example, that age was an important, very, very important axis which one had to explore. Hmm. In fact, without factoring age, you would not make sense of much. Because the older men earn very differently compared to the younger men. The younger women are in a very different place compared to the older women. So age entered the picture. This was one thing. The second thing, of course, was I found that, see, as a researcher, I found that it's very important for us to go into the field wanting to talk to other human beings, rather than research subjects. So I realized that people look at you the same way you look at them. So they wanted details about my life. They wanted to know about me. So, and of course, I think it worked to my advantage that I did not live a standard, normal Malayali life. You know. The fact that I am twice divorced, that I'm a single mother, that I mean, I pursue a career, with difficulty at that time, particularly. I shouldered family responsibilities. So these are things I think which actually helped communication. So in some ways, when they told they're all single mothers who are struggling to raise their children. So at some level, empathy. I mean, though of course my life is far very distant from theirs, but there were some bridgeheads, I think, which we built through sustained long conversations. This fieldwork lasted from 2013 to 2018. So it's 5 years of fieldwork. And almost like in the first few years, it was almost daily. And then the after 2 years, it was weekly or monthly. And then, of course, even now, of course, for marriages and childbirth and festivals, Eid, all that is spent there. So it's a continuing association. But I think what is really important is to realize that they look at you, and they basically they will not. People don't talk to people have no need to talk to you. Why should they talk to you? So unless they find some kind of a point of connection with you, so that brought me down from my high horse, I think. So when I was in the field, I was very much, a single mother, very much, a divorced woman, bearing the stigma of divorce, and so on.
Okay, very interesting. And this is something again which one would never encounter in the archive. There's a certain kind of stillness of the archive which you cannot shake up in these kinds of ways. However exciting the search might be, and so on.
Yeah, and triangulating the data was important because I know a lot of
I
my
agree.
colleagues who ask me, how are you going to just use all these words? Because these are all subjective things that people tell you.
Absolutely.
No, because first of all, you triangulate it. So it's not simply borrowing, it's not writing down what people tell you, right?
Absolutely.
First of all, you are it's a cohort. So you have like a whole set of people. So one person's account may easily contradict another. And by actually, probing, the differences, you actually get more and more information. The same cohort, two people may give you two different accounts, and then you have to probe those differences. That's one way of proceeding. The other is to triangulate with the field survey. So many of the things that people said could be corroborated from earlier accounts. This place is much studied, so there at least I was able to locate at least two surveys done prior. So you could use that information to corroborate, you know, when I did the analysis.
Is there anybody else who wants to come in now? We
Uh,
still have another 20 minutes. Michael?
Arima, uh, uh, I just want to smuggle in a question. Um, what do you think of this recently highly reported fact that the present government has been able to extend their political presence from the field of welfare to care, meaning being practically present in the household. I mean, sometimes I think that it resonates more, more like the old charity work. Charity work also had a presence in the
Sir,
household.
that is the big change. See, there's a change in discourse, which is rather frightening. Because I remember when we first went there, people talked about rights, especially among the generations. Remember, we interviewed 3 generations. The first generation was emphatic, and it was such an experience to talk to those senior people. And this, I will never forget this senior man whom I told you had lost his eyesight. He was the son of a scavenger, I mean, somebody who had been in Karimadam since 1930s. Somebody who had just finished a 10th standard education. He did not even go to 10th standard. He actually went to school only till the 3rd standard. And then on his own, did the Tulyada exam. He did the
Yeah,
Tulyada exam. He was like 75 or 76 or something. So he told me, I'm 10th pass, I've studied. And his education is all party education. So he's somebody who's gone to party school since the 1940s, right up to 1980s. And so you should just hear him speak. The kind of dignity and grace, and this, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps when I remember him, because the kind of dignity and grace and this pride in citizenship.
okay.
Talk, there was absolutely no concession to any superiority on, no way. So you may be a researcher, a big deal. So you know much less about the world than me. That was his whole, and he and his partner, for both of them, the welfare that they received was their right. Nothing more, nothing less. Audaryame alla. Now it's the other way around. Now it's this very fatherly figure of the state who's like taking care of everybody. So there is a huge shift in the way I think the state is perceived from this first generation to now. And to me, it is worrying.
That's an interesting point. Thank you very much. You gave us all different things to think about.
Any last questions before we thank Devika more effusively? Okay, thanks so much, Devika. Um, we expect you to come back again and again. This is just the first in the series. And you're just around the corner from us. So hopefully we are going to do so many things together. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Anybody else who wants to send us your address, email address, or telephone number to be added to our mailing list or WhatsApp group, please add it here. We will add you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.